Hi everybody and welcome to your 22nd chapter in Java EE 7 tutorial series. In this tutorial, we'll be talking about more advanced topics on bean validation. Now, sometimes the given constraints and validator messages in the Java API may not really suit your needs. This is where custom constraints, messages, and constraint groups come in. So what we'll be covering is creating custom constraints, validator messages, grouping constraints, and using method constraints and type hierarchies. So first of all, creating custom constraints. Using the built-in constraints to make a new constraint. This is basically taking one constraint, adding it to another pre-existing one, and it makes another constraint, which makes the constraint easier to make and understand. For example, you may take multiple constraints and just make it verify an email. This you can set as an @email constraint, which is made up of multiple built-in constraints that all verify a certain part of the email. Now, let's take a look at removing ambiguity in constraint targets. We've talked about ambiguity in constraint targets before, but I will address it here too. When we set a constraint on the method or constructor level, meaning above the method, this creates an ambiguity if the method has parameters as well. You may want to specify what the constraint is on, the return type or the method parameters. This is what the validation applies to attribute solves. So over here in this example, you can see that the validation applies to sets the target to your return type instead of your parameters, which removes all ambiguity and makes your code much easier to read. Next, there's customizing validator messages. The constraints that are built into the Java API have default locales for the messages they send back when an error is found. These messages can be customized and can be localized for non-English speaking locales. The validation messages resource bundle is a properties file, an extension of a resource bundle. And the validation.properties is the default properties file. A locale variant like Spanish Mexico would be validation messages _es for Espanol and Spanish .properties. So let's take a look at grouping constraints. Constraint groups are created to use multiple constraints at the same time. Constraint groups are represented by either interfaces, or you can also create constraint groups that also inherit from other groups. When a constraint is declared, it specifies the constraint group it is part of with the group's element. You can also have multiple groups specified with the @not null with multiple groups inside it. Now to customize group validation order, usually the order of validation does not matter, but sometimes it may become useful to do one validation before the other. An example of this would be to validate if the item is a food before validating if it's a fruit. This saves time when computing. And to group validation, you use the @group sequence. Now to use method constraints and type hierarchies. When adding constraints to methods, you have to take special care to avoid unintended errors when using subtypes. The following code over here shows an incorrect way to use method parameter constraints in class hierarchy. Here, you can see that the subclass employee over here has a more limiting parameter in its set email than its superclass person. This is called strengthening the precondition. As you can see here, this condition is strengthened by this @verified annotation, where this @verified annotation was not here before in the person class. This is not allowed. And the following code shows another incorrect way to use method return value constraints. Here, you can see that the subclass employee overrides the getEmail method from its superclass person and effectively removes the validation of the return value on it. This is called weakening the post condition and is also not allowed. As you can see over here in the person, you have @verified, while this one, it does not have anything on it. This is weakening the post condition and is not allowed. You also have to be extremely careful of indirectly setting your code to fail when using interfaces. So the problem here, if you can find it out, is that the process order in the MyPayment class implements the constraints from the credit card payment service interface. Now, the MyPayment service process order inherits the constraints. It then checks the other interface payment service and its method, but sees that the precondition has been strengthened. This will result in a constraint declaration exception. Now to simplify that, What it means is that since this My Payment service implements from both this interface and this interface, it first checks this interface first and sees that its preconditions are strengthened to @not null and @not null again. It then checks the other implementation and sees that it's actually not strengthened in this case, which throws the error of the constraint declaration exception. And that's it. That wraps it up for everything on bean validation and its advanced topics. So now that you understand how to get different constraints for whatever purpose you want, and how to create different validator messages depending on the local you're in and what kind of culture you're trying to present your website to. But other than that, I'll see you in the next video where we'll be talking about CDI and the introduction and more advanced topics on CDI and more.